Hello and welcome to the fifth session of David Auerbach's From Leibniz to Google, 5 Paradigms of Artificial Intelligence. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Hernan. We are now moved firmly in the world of symbolic AI, which I want to emphasize really was the dominant paradigm for I don't know, at least 2 decades, and arguably 3, depending on how you look at things. Though it certainly had its ups and downs, and part of that was due to the force of the personalities involved, like Minsky and McCarthy and Newell and Simon, and also to their placement at institutions like MIT and the RAND. At the RAND Corporation? Yeah, it is the RAND Corporation, which is where the great debate between the symbolic AI people and Hubert Dreyfus took place. And I still actually don't know offhand how Dreyfus ended up at the RAND Corporation, since it doesn't, he was in California. But because of that, I put a quote from Herbert Simon's Sciences of the Artificial in the chat, which we're going to be talking about in a bit, and it's his description of the so-called physical symbol systems hypothesis, which is what one could say is a philosophical implication of symbolic AI. Simon didn't do as much programming per se, but he was very tightly tied to the symbolic AI people because he had a fundamental agreement with their answers to the questions of how one might accomplish artificial intelligence and what it was that human thinking consisted of, and how one might accomplish it. And with symbolic AI, we've done in many ways a 180-degree turn from cybernetics. We're talking about thinking abstracted away from the world in all its particulars and complexities, rather than the world abstracted away from thinking in all its complexities. And to return to the framing question for this class, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of intelligence now? And I think that the answer could be is best put by Simon. It's the ability to manipulate, the ability for a brain, a mind, an entity to manipulate symbols formally through logical methods. And that's captured by what Simon coined as the physical symbol systems hypothesis, or PSSH, which I believe was coined by Simon and Newell together, although Simon, I think, wrote considerably more about it. And the hypothesis is, fundamentally, the hypothesis is intelligence is the work of symbol systems. A physical symbol system has the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action. And let's set aside what exactly a physical symbol system is for the moment to consider the hypothesis itself. It's a very strong statement because it says that it is both a necessary and a sufficient condition. There's no intelligence without a physical symbol system, and you can't have a physical symbol system without there being intelligence. And it still strikes me as astonishingly bold. It's in marked contrast to what we spoke about last week with regard to the cyberneticists, where I propose that they wish to relativize and decenter the very concept of intelligence by making it a posterior quality that emerged out of complex systems of organisms and their environments. AI for the physical symbol systems hypothesis is quite the opposite. This is intelligence is now set up as a metric, and there's no doubt that it's the human that's being set up as a measure of intelligence. We're very much talking about human intelligence here, with other animal intelligences being somewhat secondary and inferior and not quite qualifying as intelligence. And to a point, this is not an unreasonable move. By and large, what we mean by intelligence and what we do with it on a day-by-day basis is thoroughly centered around the human, but it's still a shift in the stated problem that artificial intelligence is trying to solve, so much so that the coining of the phrase artificial intelligence in the mid-1950s by John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky is not just a means of divorcing their project sociologically from that of the cyberneticists, but it's also a way of reconceiving the entire project of what the cyberneticists term the study of control and coping. For the cyberneticists, intelligence served control, and now control serves intelligence. But what is it? What is this intelligence that they're talking about that the cyberneticists were at such pains to avoid specifying? So let us get to the term physical symbol system and what it means. This is how Simon put it in the late 60s, and this is the quote that I attached here, and I'm going to read it out, but you can read along because the terminology he's using is important. A physical symbol system holds a set of entities called symbols. These are physical patterns, e.g. chalk marks on a blackboard, that can occur as components of symbol structures. In the case of computers, a symbol system also possesses a number of simple processes that operate upon symbol structures, processes that create, modify, copy, and destroy symbols. One can see the link to a Turing machine. A physical symbol system is a machine that, as it moves through time, produces an evolving collection of symbol structures. Symbol structures can, and commonly do, serve as internal representations, e.g. mental images, of the environment to which the symbol system is seeking to adapt. They allow it to model that environment with greater or less veridicality and in greater or less detail, and consequently to reason about it. Of course, for this capability to be of any use to the symbol system, it must have windows on the world and hands too. It must have means for acquiring information from the external environment that can be encoded into internal symbols, as well as means for producing symbols that can initiate action upon the environment. Thus, it must use symbols to designate objects and relations and actions in the world external to the system. Symbols may also designate processes that the symbol system can interpret and execute. Hence, what governs the behavior of a symbol system can be stored along with other symbol structures in the system's own memory and executed when activated. Now, this physical symbol system sounds a tremendous amount like a computer, like the classical computer that was spreading throughout the world at the very time that this hypothesis was created. The existence of this computer machine, this tangible and programmable machine, is of fundamental significance to the very creation of the physical symbol systems hypothesis. Just as Ada Lovelace was rhapsodized by the thought of the analytical engine, we can say that Simon and Newell were rhapsodized by the considerably more concrete phenomenon of the digital computer. So I'd like to ask what people make of the physical symbol systems hypothesis. Anyone? Hernan, did you?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about it right now, but it makes me think about which is the level of detail you need to operate efficiently in this. I mean, you could go indefinitely describing a world and the relationships between different objects. But yeah, now I'm trying to figure out if this, well, basically what they were asking, if this is the correct approach to intelligence, or if it's just application of this logical concoction to the brain and how it works. Anyway, yeah. Sorry, I'm babbling.
No. I think you hit. I think you hit the nail on the head. Actually, I think that is exactly what it raises. Is how are these things connected? How did he get to this?
I mean, to further detail, like obviously there's a series of common responses. Dreyfus, and we read some of this. The unconscious is certainly one of them. Other oppositions to this framework, this formal framework of physical patterns that are made into expressions that are through processes manipulated and produce new processes. It's obviously like a logical calculus based on Humean induction, and related to the Chalmers Clarkian conception of extended mind. I'm personally pretty sympathetic towards it, but just to take the position that Searle or someone would pose, reducing intelligence into sequencing symbols or syntactical language to world relations omits something called understanding that is more epiphenomenal or something extra than just this a functional framework. So I mean, but there's of course a response to Searle that this type of derivation from axioms is also not attentive to, like, digital computation programs are not merely representational systems, but also engaged in representing activities. So what Searle calls understanding deprived syntax actually reduces the understanding of semiology to intentionality without specifying any success conditions. And I mean, there's arguably this is like not the way that we should be thinking about syntax, the way that Searle poses it. But I mean, this is obviously like just one of several responses that really just highlight understanding as something not based in the patterning.
Yeah, well, and I think it's good that you brought up Searle, because Searle enters at least the philosophical picture with his Chinese room argument and is making this case, but the case is very much being made against AI as formulated in this sort of way. That if you look at the Chinese room, it makes a lot more sense if you see it as being addressed to the physical symbol systems hypothesis. But Searle generally phrases it as being addressed towards AI more generally, and that's because this paradigm is so dominant that's all AI appears to be, at least to Searle. Yeah.
Yeah, just a short comment that came to my mind is that I think a premise of this hypothesis seems to be that humans are actually doing these things. That we are actually, it's not just our conception of ourselves, but that we are actually doing these things, that we are manipulating symbols. Yes. And that it's not just something that is reducible to something else.
Yes.
And I mean, that's a bold hypothesis.
Yes.
Eric, can you elucidate? Do you mean that this is like a matter of scalar observation, that if we were to take this perhaps at a closer, choose a different scalar point, that we could break, these functions into, subatomic, whatever, and so on and so on. So it depends on scale. What do you mean?
Yes, but basically that okay. That it appears to us in our self-conception that we are doing these things, that we are operating with symbols, but that if we could look at it in a reductivist way, a reductionist way, that okay, everything that's happening here is, for example, describable in the terms of the cyberneticists, and maybe one could say, okay, yeah, even if it is reducible to these naturalist images, maybe the most important, that if these processes of dealing with symbols, operating with symbols, are reducible to processes that are not operating in a symbolic way. And the question is, does this anything to this to the hypothesis at all? That's maybe.
So what would be extra symbolic, like the unconscious? Because I mean that's what like Dreyfus would perhaps say, but
I don't know about. I think the concept about unconscious is too unclear, at least to me, to bring it into here.
well, exactly. So the impulse is to sort of side with the cyberneticists. No, you're saying this is unclear, it needs to be codifiable, and therefore, ergo, you're actually siding, you know, with those who want to take this approach.
I don't side with anyone. I just discuss hypotheses. I have no positions.
Okay, but I mean, in saying that there's an unclarity, it means that you want to be able to pattern and create sort of a symbol pushing.
I just
You
said
know,
that
like
the
a
concept
logical
of
calculus.
I just said that the concept of the unconscious is too unclear for me to
It doesn't
use
need
in
to.
this.
Yeah. So, but this don't.
That's everything I have said.
Okay. I just mean like, you know, I understand this opposition. That's not unclear, but I think that implies that clarity exists, and this clarity would be that object pushing, patronizing the logical calculus of Leibniz and Hume's atomic impressions, and that's what sort of this framework depends upon. But anyway, I will be quiet.
No, thank you for that. I think that is a good scene setting, because the conceptual areas that I think all of you were speaking about are indeed conceptual areas that are not always being talked about explicitly, and yet because there's a fundamental act of hypostatizing here that I think that the cyberneticists wanted to avoid, of saying, okay, what is going on? And I'm going to speak to that in a bit, about why it is that this move was made, and why people thought this move needed to be made. I want to fixate on what, in the definition that Simon gave of the physical symbol systems hypothesis, is we haven't quite defined what intelligent action is, much less intelligence. And as Margaret Bowden points out, Simon was not an arch rationalist. In fact, he was one of the people who fought against economists who thought that humans were just rational creatures who always, you know, bought stuff for the lowest price, and markets would always be efficient. Simon believed in the need, strongly believed in the need for heuristics, and he did not think people were guaranteed to function logically or rationally. But he did tear open the black box of thinking, of the mind, and insist that it be portrayed in a very specific way. The cybernetician would say that symbols are posterior towards whatever mechanisms serve homeostasis. Cybernetician says, don't think about a talking machine, don't think about Turing's imitation game or the computers trying to play it. Think about an animal or organism or machine in the world. Simon and the other symbolic AI proponents want you not to think about the world in that way. Instead, the goal is to come up with a nearly a priori language, and I put language in quotes, of thought that can cope with any potential world, not just a specific world. These symbol structures are written in a universal language, and it is their semantic weight that gives them their import rather than their pragmatic usage that determines their semantics. The semantic and the pragmatic impact each other quite deeply, but this is the Copernican turn at work, from the pragmatic to the semantic, from moving from concrete situations of action to a more abstracted world of meaning. And this is a profoundly philosophical move that sort of happens without anyone seeming to realize it at the time. And I find this amazing because it's like a little philosophical controversy plays itself out without the participants quite knowing they're having a philosophical discussion rather than a discussion around cognitive science, computer science, neuroscience, psychology, and things like that. But because a lot of these people are coming from out of the Vienna circle of logicism, that philosophical background is certainly there. And at least some of the people, Simon in particular, must have been aware of it. It just never quite peeks through boldly. And with the move to the semantic, we've firmly entered the world of language and signs rather than of signals and patterns, which, as I said when we were talking about information theory, are constructs that were created to specifically avoid problems. The symbolic AI people want to overcome the problem of sensory modalities, namely that their machines don't have sensory modalities, by representing the world in formal logic. And it's helpful that Simon gives his own definition of what a symbol is and how it works, because the concepts of symbols and signs are some of the most overloaded and ambiguous in all of philosophy, cognitive science, linguistics, and a myriad of other fields. From my perspective, the essential thing about a symbol is that it is a mark of the semantic. It bears some sort of meaning. But I acknowledge that that punts the problem to one of defining what meaning is, and I'm entirely comfortable with saying that indeed, my meaning is a multifaceted and elusive thing. In the analytic tradition from which Simon is drawing, the primary ideas associated with symbols and signs are Frege's notions of Sinn and Bedeutung, or sense and reference. The sense of a word, sign, or symbol is our understanding it, what we take it to mean, and the role the word, sign, or symbol plays in our thoughts. While the referent, the Bedeutung, is what the word, sign, or symbol actually denotes, or that object out in the world to which it refers. This distinction has been contested and argued over since Frege made it, and I won't relitigate any of it here, other than to stress that in the analytic tradition, meaning has retained this Janus face nature. On the one hand, a symbol has an epistemological role in thought, its sense, its sin. On the other hand, it has a metaphysical role in denotation, its reference, Bedeutung. And that, I think, offers a key to Simon's usage of the term symbols, because he very much seeks to use symbols to bridge that gap. But we can see what Simon is doing here is offering a proposal to bridge the world of rote computation, even algorithmic computation, with intelligent action embedded in the world. And this harkens back to the conflation that we saw Hobbes make in the second week of the course, when he wished to extend computation beyond pure mathematical operations on numbers into conceptual and even practical areas of human cognition. And would it not be great if that leap could be made so simply? Simon wants to say that symbols are the means by which we make that leap. Let's use his definition from semantics from an interview he gave in 1989 from an excellent book called Speaking Minds. This is, I guess it's inverted, but it's interviews with a bunch of cognitive scientists. It wasn't published until 1995, but the interviews were conducted around 89. And it's a good portrait of the field at the time, and certainly, even though it says it's cognitive science, AI is all over the place here. And it has Dreyfus, it's got Dennett, it's got the Churchlands, it's got Newell and Simon, it's got Hilary Putnam, it's got Rumelhart and Sanowski, it's got Weiner, and it's got Searle. And you can see how they are arguing with each other and arguing past each other. It's worth taking a look. So the definition Simon gives here is semantics simply means that you have definitions connecting things that come in through your senses with the stuff that is going on inside. Oh, the name of the book, let me write it down. It is Speaking Minds. Oh, and I see now, Aiken. Game theory was a immense topic of study in the exact same by the exact same people. I mean, Simon was working on it, and this idea of that sort of modeling was entering into the picture. And game theory has its role in the symbolic AI of the time. It's just not. It serves as a tool towards the sort of ends we're talking about here. Anyway, okay, Simon, yeah. Semantics simply means that you have definitions connecting things that come in through your senses with the stuff that is going on inside. And for Simon and for a number of the symbolic AI people, I think that semantics was conceptualized in this very elegant and simple manner. Semantics is the bridge from sensory input to thought, and there just isn't anything terribly complicated, not at the level that would compel Immanuel Kant to write hundreds of pages about how it is that we can have any thoughts in the first place. And here's Simon's example from the same book. He says, suppose computers have input organs, and suppose the input organ on a particular computer is such that when you point at a tape recorder, it says tape recorder, and it does not say that when you point at something quite different. I don't know of any criterion of understanding that would say I understand what a tape recorder does, but the machine does not. It might not know what makes it run, but I don't know either. Simon here elides, I think, the pragmatic aspects, such as what we find all over the place in later Wittgenstein and in Quine, that for some words there is not this absolute idea of pointing to some object and some word immediately coming to mind, and that word being the word from whatever it is you pointed to. And obviously the entirety of deconstructionism and post-structuralism obsesses about just how unsatisfactory this picture is. But for Simon, there it is. There's a great book called The Mind of a Mnemonist by the Russian neuroscientist Luria. And it talks about one of his patients, S, who had a truly eidetic memory. It was absolutely photographic. If he saw something, he'd remember forever without any errors ever, to the extent that he used memory palaces in his mind to remember things that were particularly tricky. And if he misremembered something, he never added, if he was asked to remember, say, an arbitrary set of symbols, if he made a mistake, it was always just him omitting something. He never got one wrong. And they would ask him, well, why did you forget that symbol? And he said, oh, well, I was looking through my memory palace and I'd hidden it in a dusty corner and the light wasn't good enough, so I didn't see it. That's exactly how photographic his memory was. And the interesting thing was that when it came to words, he actually did have this very direct notion that he could not deal with words that had abstractions, and he couldn't read poetry because each word immediately called to mind a specific image. So if you talked about, say, the tree of life, he immediately thought of a real tree. He couldn't conceptualize it. Yes, a bit like Funes, but in a way even more ingenious because it limited his brain in terms of how his thoughts could work. That there was no room even for variability of meaning, and concepts like zero. He said, well, what is nothing? I don't have a picture for it, so I don't understand what the word means. And when I read definitions like Simon's right now, I think of that because I feel like that's almost what a version of language, as Simon is proposing, would amount to. That you've shut out ambiguity because there's none of this because there's far less interplay between whatever these mysterious workings are of semantics and pragmatics that condition words to have these nuances of complexity. But for Simon, the symbols act as the internal representations that minds, brains, or computers use to create thoughts, and they function as bearing sense there. And they function in very algorithmic and definite ways. We could say computational ways. They're being created, modified, copied, and destroyed. The symbols, at the same time, denote objects in the real world and must do so more or less accurately. And in that regard, the symbols function as bearing reference. And the Fregean distinction is here in whole cloth, as well as the conflation of those two aspects that Frege postulated. But for symbols to serve this admittedly hefty role, the connection between sense and reference and between thought and denotation must be robust, and it must also be fairly atomic. And what I mean by atomic is that Simon is presuming that a symbol denotes an object in a manner reasonably independent from whatever it is others may denote or designate, and in a manner reasonably independent from context. Quine at this very time was contesting that such an atomic sense of meaning was even workable, and in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Quine suggests that symbols are so unworkable in this atomic sense that a semantic project of philosophy independent of a larger embedded pragmatism simply doesn't make sense. But Simon disagrees with that. He says here, symbol systems are called physical to remind the reader that they exist in real-world devices fabricated of glass and metal for computers, or flesh and blood in brains. In the past, we have been more accustomed to thinking of symbol systems of mathematics and logic as abstract and disembodied, leaving out of account the paper and pencil and human minds that were required to actually bring them to life. And I'll paste this quote too. Computers have transported symbol systems from the Platonic heaven of ideas to the empirical world of actual processes carried out by machines or brains, or by the two of them working together. Again, from the Platonic heaven of ideas to the empirical world of actual processes carried out by machines or brains. And here we have a somewhat rare moment of Simon making an explicit metaphysical claim, which is that there has been a category mistake in conceiving of in how we conceive of mathematics and formal logic. They are not abstractions entertained by human minds, or rather they are, but they are something beyond that. They are the very stuff of human thought itself. The processes of thinking, whether done by computers or by human brains, are nothing more and nothing less than the processes of the logical and mathematical manipulation of symbols. We may not see these manipulations going on in the nervous activity of the brain, and we may not be able to observe the minutiae through purely behavioral observation. But Simon and Newell are both very convinced that real intelligent activity requires that the manipulation of symbols be physically instantiated at some emergent level of the activity of an agent. Where the cyberneticists shrugged their shoulders and said, the magic happens somehow, but the details are less important than the effects, the symbolic AI people say that the magic can only happen in this very specific way. And conveniently, it can happen with the tools at hand, this Turing equivalent computer. So I want to take a look back now at Carnap for the roots of this equation of formal symbol manipulation with thought. And it might be good, if you can, to open up Carnap to page 193, simply because it's Carnap, and if I read this out loud, it's probably best to read along. Let's see. The text we're reading is from 1950. It's called The Logical Foundations of Probability. And here Carnap briefly discusses what a machine might and might not accomplish. Here he says, the same point has sometimes been formulated by saying it is not possible to construct an inductive machine. The latter is presumably meant as a mechanical contrivance which, when fed an observational report, would furnish a suitable hypothesis, just as a computing machine, when supplied with two factors, furnishes their product. Again, echoes of Hobbes. I am completely in agreement that an inductive machine of this kind is not possible. However, I think we must be careful not to draw too far-reaching negative consequences from this fact. I do not believe that this fact excludes the possibility of a system of inductive logic with exact rules or the possibility of an inductive machine with a different, more limited aim. And I think that Carnap is rather cautious in this reading in saying that a kind of mechanized induction, or thought, if you will, can be achieved if the language or meta-language in which induction is done is specified precisely enough. Precisely enough, that is, to turn induction to a straightforward mechanized process. deduction was already seen as such a process where you draw out your conclusions from your starting premises by rote. Carnap says that given a sufficiently robust and clear meta-language, the same can be done for inductive statements. He makes this seemingly paradoxical statement, quote, on page 200, any procedure of proof in any field, also in inductive logic, is ultimately a deductive procedure. But he clarifies by saying that the most mysterious parts we would call non-deductive logic are not in fact part of that logic, part of the logic at all, but are moves in the subject matter being regimented into the logical induction. The inductive process itself is no less, is no more unclear than the deductive process. What Simon does is make a move at the level of the subject matter, saying that yes, there are these parts of induction that don't take place in Carnap's meta-language of logic, the part that can be mechanized. But those extra parts fall under this field of heuristics, and that too can be mechanized. At times, Simon seems to go far enough that he seems to be collapsing the distinction Carnap is making and saying that no, it really is all logic. I confess that I'm genuinely not sure whether Simon actually makes that move or not. I think it's probably most charitable to say that Simon is willing to consider Carnap's separation of the areas of induction, but that for Simon, even the areas that Carnap set aside are still ruled ultimately by formal logic. They simply need heuristics in order to narrow down the tremendous state spaces that need to be searched. It's a difference in scale and possibly in domain, but not a difference in kind. Now, 6 years later, in John McCarthy's paper, The Inversion of Functions Defined by Turing Machines, McCarthy is considering a machine that can solve what he calls well-defined intellectual problems in a similar context from with Simon. McCarthy is looking at it from the perspective of Turing computability rather than formal logic, but since all statements of formal logic can be regimented as Turing computable forms, although not necessarily provable forms, as Kurt Gödel showed, the context is essentially the same. McCarthy says that a well-defined intellectual problem is one that admits to a test that can be applied to a proposed solution to assess whether the solution is correct or not. This is pure Vienna circle verificationism. A statement or solution can be verified as true or false, as correct or incorrect. And I guess I'll say a little bit about Gödel and incompleteness here for anyone that Gödel was also in the Vienna circle, and incompleteness was one of the major mathematical and logical proofs of the 20th century, top 10, top 5, top 2 maybe, showing that within any sufficiently complex, formally axiomized system, there will inevitably be statements that cannot be proven within that system, that ultimately any system of formal logic, formal mathematics is incomplete. And this is extended to show that there are certain computer programs that is impossible to write, that the very existence of certain programs would entail a logical contradiction of true being equal to false. And the most famous of these is the so-called halting problem, which is a halting problem would be solved if you could write a program that takes any, you feed it some code, you feed it a program, and it tells you whether or not that, and you feed it the input to that program, and it tells you whether or not that program with those inputs will run forever or whether it will terminate. And that program cannot be written if it, because the existence of such a general program that would do that entails a logical contradiction. And if anyone's curious, it's a cube proof, and and certainly given that I'd been having trouble with the incompleteness, with a lot of incompleteness proofs, it was the first one that I think made intuitive sense to me, and is why I became a computer scientist instead of a mathematician. So McCarthy goes on to say that if any test can be Turing computable, we can simply obtain whatever problem for which a solution exists by inverting the function. Instead of going from solution to verification, you start from the test and go to the solution. McCarthy became convinced that this approach was not workable, but his move here is epistemologically and metaphysically significant because he's taking the Vienna Circle's approach wholesale into the computer age by saying that, at least to the limits Gödel specified, solving whatever problems you'd like is really just a matter of selection, finding the right function. And of course, all this can be done in formal logic or in Turing machine instruction sets. I'm not sure that Carnap would have immediately signed on to the possibility of any test being performable by a Turing machine. He might have at least had second thoughts, but I think this McCarthy essay gives you the clearest idea as to why this logicism took hold at this point in time, particularly with regard to applying logicism to thought. There was this fundamental dogma that there was nothing other than logic. No truth without logic, no meaning without logic, no thinking without logic. If you want a slightly more relaxed version, you could say no truth without Turing computability, no meaning without Turing computability, or perhaps no truth without mathematics, no meaning without mathematics. These all amount to the same thing, even though they read differently. And this notion of the universality of the Turing machine and the inevitability of computation and computability is what allowed Simon to echo Hobbes's conflation of strict computation with abstract thought. Because at the bottom, there's nothing else for thought to be other than computation. That's the mostly unstated dogma, and here McCarthy states it. And flowing from this, Simon's response to the rejoinder that this logic might be completely intractable if you attempt to replicate it on a computer, which is what von Neumann hinted at when he was talking about the possibility of using McCulloch and Pitz's logical forms to represent the human nervous system. Simon's response is to the intractability of the problem is, well, use heuristics. Now, symbolic AI was not always quite so fierce with regard to specifying how an agent might manipulate symbols. They didn't always insist that the human mind worked through formal logic, only that formal logic was the best tool by which to model such processes on a computer, at least initially. And you can see this in the very fierce back and forth following McCarthy's presentation of the programs with common sense with Yehoshua Bar Hillel, which we'll get to in a bit. And to be fair, McCarthy's agenda is a bit different from Simon and Newell, but broadly speaking, and especially at that time, he is on the same page with regard to wanting to use symbolic logic and logical operators to model human thought. Regardless of the strength of the claim, the symbolic AI people have elevated symbolic logic to a much higher plane of significance compared to the cyberneticians, who never saw it as any sort of tool for semantic meaning, only for the external modeling of the systems under consideration. There may well be logic inside, but they would very much prefer to be agnostic on that. And to that end, you can recall von Neumann's statement about the human nervous system not necessarily being able to fit in the known universe if you use McCulloch and Pitz's representations. In other words, the representation is equivalent, but it's not identical. The form isn't the same. For the symbolic AI people, they're getting far closer to making a claim not just of functional equivalence, but of methodological equivalence and a formal equivalence. This logic isn't just a way of presenting a model of what goes on in the brain, but it's awfully close to what the brain is actually doing, just at a higher level of abstraction than the nervous system. Now, how on earth do we know this? Well, it's a Kantian transcendental argument. The necessary conditions for the possibility of thinking are that the thinking entity be a physical symbol system. So the only way that humans could possibly think and act as we do is if they somehow instantiated a physical symbol system with their brains, QED, or not, depending. But that I believe is the position being taken, and that I think is my answer to some of the questions that I think Eric and Aiken were discussing earlier. So I'd like to go. So the agenda for symbolic AI is on thought at that higher level of abstraction rather than on neural activity or stimulus response. And when you look at Newell and Simon's GPS, their general problem solver, it's explained as a program that uses heuristics in solving problems in formal logic. And in the second paper, which it might be useful to open up to now, I'm looking at the 1961 paper, GPS, a program that simulates human thought. The actual primary programmer here was J.C. Shaw, who's not credited on this paper, but who is credited, I think, on the original GPS paper. He I think did most of the grunt work on this. The GPS is explained as a program that uses heuristics in solving problems in formal logic. And they're comparing it in the second paper to how a human solves the same such formal logic problems. And they're looking for parallels, and they find them. And the conclusion that in the very title of the paper, the program simulates human thought. And I'd like to, and now I'm going to speak for a while about how they get there. At the beginning of this paper, Newell and Simon invoke two schools of psychology, the behaviorist school and the Gestalt school. The behaviorist school, which I think is best known through the work of B.F. Skinner, is more or less a hyper-functional applied at the level of the entire human being. The mind itself is to be treated as a black box. People's reports of their thoughts are to be treated with extreme suspicion, if not total indifference and dismissal. And the basis of behavioral analysis is in Pavlovian stimulus and response, inputs and outputs. And this gives rise to a very old joke about a behaviorist having sex with her partner. And at the end of it, she says to her partner, well, did the earth move for me? The observer is more reliable than the subject in behaviorism. And you can see how such behaviorism impacted cybernetics, but as we saw, cybernetics shied away from making the human being's relation with its environment the measure of anything, and certainly the measure of cybernetic success at modeling. The cyberneticians generalized the concept of any system, whether it's the nervous system or an amoeba or stock market, and that system's relationships with whatever other entities exist in an environment in the general sense. Symbolic AI, on the other hand, is thoroughly anthropocentric. The human is the measure of all things intelligent, very explicitly, as we see in the Newell and Simon paper. They go through the solving of this logic problem, which certainly no animal other than a human could solve. And they have a human explain their reasoning processes, and then we see how GPS matched up in terms of whether it followed the same steps. With regard to GPS, did the GPS's heuristics for solving the logic problem follow the same linear path as the human's ordered list of steps that they took? So Newell and Simon have an implicit rejoinder to cybernetics, which is that cybernetics is too behaviorist, too mechanistic, and too determinate. On page 110 of the of this paper, they say, behaviorism accepted and indeed reinforced the mechanistic assumption that the connections between stimulus and response were formed and maintained as simple determinate functions of the environment. And to be fair to cybernetics did complicate this picture precisely by saying that these functions were not determinate in any real way. Cyclical feedback and complex nonlinear dynamics made any sort of behaviorist paradigm far more complicated than the behaviorists themselves made it out to be. But the rejoinder has an extension, which is that even if you incorporate these more complex sorts of models that the cyberneticians are proposing, you don't capture something essential about how humans act in the world. And by act, we are including in that term whatever thinking contributes to the act. There's some black box that needs to be opened. And to that end, and to making that case, Newell and Simon invoke a reference that they probably wouldn't today, which is Gestalt psychology. They say, in many ways, Gestalt psychology continued the Würzburg school's insistence that thinking was more than association. Thinking has direction given to it by the task or by the set of the subject. Gestalt psychology elaborated this doctrine in genuinely new ways in terms of holistic principles of organization. What are these holistic principles of organization? They don't quite say, but the emphasis is on the word holistic. Gestalt psychology emphasizes the term emergence before emergence was a term of art. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and so considering individual behavior is not enough. One needs some sort of overall hypothetical or inductive model to begin from before the individually observed behaviors of a creature or a human can be said to be understood. In practice, this often amounted to something approximating a structuralist paradigm. People's behaviors and interactions can be lumped into certain simple models, and all you need to do is to take the individual pieces you see and squeeze them into this overall picture that you begin with. The thorny problem being, obviously, how do you know your starting picture is accurate to begin with? Newell and Simon don't quite confront this problem, but they do use the Gestalt argument against behaviorism and indeed against logical empiricism to argue that we need to go inside the black box of the mind by assuming mental models and mechanisms of organization of thoughts in the brain. And this is an ironic move coming from Newell and Simon, who are proceeding from the logicist and arch-empirical Vienna circle. Because while they want to preserve the emphasis on logic, they are seemingly violating the emphasis on individually and empirically verifiable statements that the Vienna circle stressed. Because there's now this hazy aura of hypothetical mental models floating around that aren't going to be verified anytime soon. But this is very useful for their project because it allows them to presume this model and then do a bit of psychological experimenting, comparing human and reasoning with the reasoning that GPS does. It's sort of an inverted Turing test. Instead of the computer trying to fool a human, the humans are now trying to make the computer match up with the human, and that task is a bit easier. Here's another quote. They say, "We treat skeptically the subjective elements in our experiments and agree that all notions must eventually be made operational by means of behavioral measures. We also recognize that a human being is a tremendously complex organized systems and that the simple schemes of modern behavioristic psychology seem hardly to reflect this at all." So let me point out what seems to be something of a contradiction. At the same time that Newell and Simon are invoking Gestalt psychology and holism against the strict empiricism of behaviorism and against the stimulus response feedback models, black box models of cybernetics, Newell and Simon are simultaneously embracing a non-holistic, atomistic formal logic when it comes to portraying the language of thought, that which Carnap shied away from, in fact. In other words, while Simon and Newell contend that behavior and psychology cannot be taken apart and modeled in a vacuum because it requires this emergent thing called thinking that cannot be captured at the level of behavioral psychology, at the same time they're making that contention. They're saying that thinking itself can be taken apart and modeled in a vacuum. And so it's a bit of atomism for me, but not for thee. And in a larger sense, we can see this shift as a matter of 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. On the one hand, black box functionalism at the level of the organism, which is what cybernetics proposes, is considered too reductionistic. And what can I say? Yes, Jesse. Let's see. So again, on the one hand, the cybernetic black box functionalism is considered too reductionistic, and there's this new emergent thought that needs to be entertained, and that's a product of the cognitive psychology that was being done in the 1950s, as well as work by Chomsky, and you can see in game theory and economics, all of this ties into that. On the other hand, now that we're talking about thought, we begin by taming it to the point that we have reduced thought itself to something that can be captured in fairly simple expressions of formal logic, and by the idea of the physical symbol system. And that, I think, is what happens in this GPS paper when Simon and Newell compare the trace of their program with the protocol of a student trying to solve the logic problem. It's an elementary problem in symbolic formal logic, and for people who can't parse it, I mean, I don't want to go through it, but did people get sort of the main idea of what's going on in this formal logic problem? It's to take one expression in formal logic and using a number of rules, transform that expression into a different equivalent expression. And the challenge is to figure out which rule should be applied in which order. does anyone have a question about the problem under consideration that I can answer quickly? Okay, cool. Anyway, GPS breaks the problem down. GPS breaks the problem down into subtasks using heuristics, rejecting approaches it tries if they don't work out, and trying them in an order designated by the heuristics, such as one of these heuristics is the simplicity of the resulting expression after applying one of the rules. Simon and Newell aren't claiming that every problem is approached by a human in this particular form. What they want is to assess whether humans go through a similar set of tasks in approaching this particular problem, and they conclude that this human does mostly. If you look at pages 119 and 120, you can see their comparisons. They give some of the program trace and then quote the student. What they stress is that there are points where the student chose a particular reduction rule and GPS chose the same rule, and thus they conclude that a similar thinking process is going on. So what sort of thinking is occurring here? Well, it's a matter of selection, and I want to stress the link back to Ashby and Ashby's emphasis on selection, the idea that information theory can be applied to organisms and their environment by considering communication between an organism and its environment as a matter of possible messages out of an ensemble. Just as Chomsky transformed that paradigm into universal grammar, making grammar a matter of selecting grammatical rules from a logical form, that paradigm is covertly transformed into a sort of algorithmic thinking. As long as the combinatorial possibilities are sufficiently constrained, we can do this comparison and say, see, our program followed the same steps as a human, more or less. And so there's something similar in the heuristics in play in both the human and the machine. And you see that Simon and Newell conclude with a statement that echoes Chomsky's universal grammar very clearly on page 128. The free behavior of a reasonably intelligent human can be understood as the product of a complex but finite and determinate set of laws. Instead of Chomsky's grammatical laws, there are now thinking laws. For Simon and Newell, we had these logical laws that could be applied to formal logic problems. The extension of that, and what became a tenet of faith for Simon in particular, was that laws of this form, because they have to be logical, remember, can be applied in real life situations as well. It's just that instead of pure logic, the logical symbols now take on representational meaning. And again, it's interesting to look at Chomsky's role here because while the approach is very similar, Chomsky always avoided going to semantics and said that semantics was way too hard of a problem. And I'm not aware that he ever took on Simon and Newell directly, but it's more that he just sort of said, I'm dealing with syntax, leave me alone. Let me see. Hold on for a second and say, I want to take a break in the next 15 minutes or so, but I want to see whether I should stop here or try to finish. No, we're going to be talking about GPS for a while. So why don't, before we get into the breakdown of the comparison and the sort of and the implications of that, are there any questions or comments people would like to make right now? Actually, I see something. Gestalt research, yes. Yeah, and you can make the case. That appealing to Gestalt psychology can be something of a Hail Mary pass. I mean, in some ways, it's a anthropomorphized emergence to say to say that, well, we couldn't capture it reductionistically, so there's some magic that's happening, and here's the magic. Here's the magic. Here's how you get the magic, and we won't prove that this is the magic because it's emergent. So how can you prove it? So it's sort of a two-step in that way. But yeah, any comments or questions that people have at this point?
I think one thing that's kind of noteworthy, what reminds me of it kind of reminds me of cybernetics in that it took in the way that, oh God, I'm sorry for being so grainy. With regard to cybernetics taking up Uexküll's functional cycle in terms of looking at feedbacks, that Newell and Simon would take up Gestalt, but kind of completely ignore that the basic point is that one Gestalt isn't equal to another Gestalt necessarily. So like one Gestalt can have variance to it. So that kind of what I mean with this kind of like imperialistically holistic is very obvious when you also look at those at the other Newell and Simon text with regards to it's very clear to us that the best approach to intelligence is a common sense intelligence and heuristics that we define. And obviously, and I mean, that's kind of my assumption anyway, but I mean, the obvious question from today's standpoint is obviously, well, who's common sense? Who's reference? So, I mean, it's just interesting that there's this, I mean, I see it as an honest attempt at describing intelligence, but obviously, like, looking back from kind of like a second order perspective, it's very obvious what's kind of going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, and their rejoinder, and I'm going to get into, certainly they received these criticisms, and they have practical rejoinders, which we'll get to, but I think the implicit philosophical rejoinder is, oh, yeah, sure, it's different, but it's still always logic. So you're sure there may be variations in heuristics, but, you know, it's just, we'll just add more heuristics. And and that was the sort of punting defense for a very, very long time. Any other questions or comments right now?
Maybe one. I don't know if it was implicitly maybe already answered. It connects about back to what Eken and I were talking about at the beginning, and about this. Okay, let's take logic as at least a functional model of human thinking. That okay, every human thinking at least fulfills operates under the conditions of that also formal logic fulfills. Right. And I mean, okay, this is typically a hardcore philosophical question, but I don't think that this is so obvious, because what you can all
fair point.
You can ask just like, okay, how do I know what it is I think? Do I have any special intimate relation to my own thoughts that they are somehow fully transparent to me? How do I know that I understand my own thoughts? I mean, these are really, they take you down the rabbit hole until you can't think any longer. But to simply ignore them is also like to say, yeah, I know what I think. When
Eric, what you're proposing is we start with Plato every time we make, this is, you know, like a theory of everything that we have to sort of carve to. I mean, I think at one point when we're doing philosophy of mind, we have to take some constraints. We have to, you know, establish a few limit conditions, and this is sort of one of them is the functionalist gambit, which, you know, I see you challenge. I think it's very interesting. It's good what you're doing. These are critical questions, but at the same time, I think that, you know, when trying to propose a perspective, we've got to take some limit conditions, or else these questions will almost limit us from being able to prevent us from being able to make a few presuppositions that we can take as variables. You know, there would be too many, I don't know, like I feel like it's necessary to make some presuppositions, such as a functional paradigm.
As I said, these questions take you down the rabbit hole, and you more or less inevitably end at the point where when you don't trust your own thoughts any longer, where you cannot in any way think at all, and or you're so deep down into skepticism. Yeah, where you, like I understand that this cannot, like, to answer these questions cannot be to have an answer for these questions cannot be a condition to do philosophy of mind or artificial intelligence research. I know that. I just think that, okay, to remember oneself that, okay, we actually make this presupposition here, because one forgets them a lot of times, I think.
Or yeah, that we can say that Simon and Newell's presumption, the presumption is, that unconscious, yeah, sure, there could be an unconscious. We may not know anything else. It's still logic. We've still got it under control. We've still got heuristics and logic to get it under control. That yes, it's a very complex thing, but we've found the method by which it can be tamed, and that, I think, is their article of faith. Another hint at this actually is in Minsky's paper, when he talks about how the cyberneticians have attributed far too much importance to analog and analog feedback systems. And you can see one reason why he would say that, because, well, once you've got this language of thought that's logical, it's digital. You've got true and false. It's analog. It's instantiated through analog means, but that's just confusing the issue. It's still ultimately you can still ultimately do it digitally. You don't need to worry about the complexities of, like, the nervous system, because we've now got this nice and neat hypothesized layer on top of it that we can work through.
So do they, because as you just said, that once you have logic, you have true and false, do they conceive of, okay, classical logic with the principle of, I don't know if it's in in English, not bivalence, like, that you only have true and false, not any other truth values. They say, okay, classical logic is the paradigm to use and nothing else.
I mean, at that point, I think you're getting. I don't know I don't know if Simon and Newell had strong feelings about that. I think that the entire field of analytic philosophy and analytic logic has spent a lot of time trying to develop alternative logics that answer those critiques, and then people have thought about them. Beyond that, you start getting into sort of cognitive Bayesianism, where you replace true and false with degrees of belief. But it's still regimentable as a digital system. So the fundamental tenet is still there. You just need to, like, throw more math into the equation. So instead of something being true, it's now 80% true. And you're revising your priors. And in some ways, I suppose that is a sequel to the AI movement, to say that, well, instead of having propositions that I believe or don't believe, I have propositions to which I ascribe degrees of belief. And there are people who have literally taken this to the point of making it a metaphysical principle of quantum physics, that our Bayesian degrees of belief impact how our quantum measurements. If you ever want to really go down a rabbit hole, look up quantum Bayesianism. It's an interesting topic.
Have you read the Anil K. Seth? It's one of my favorite essays. That it's called The Cybernetic Bayesian Brain, and it's about the PP paradigm and the explicit.
Cybernetic what?
The Cybernetic Bayesian Brain. It's a very good paper. It was published as part of Open Mind in 2014.
See. Yeah, I think think you mentioned it before, and
I may have.
I looked at it briefly, but I don't have anything to say about it. So I will give it. I will give it another. Yeah. But certainly, that sort of Bayesian modeling has been very influential. In some ways, it evolved along parallel lines to deep learning and machine learning because similar forms were used, even though the paradigms were somewhat different, and mostly for reasons of time, we won't be talking about Bayesianism and Bayesnets in this course, but it's an interesting topic for how it too has impacted AI. So unless there are other comments, I think now is probably a good time to take a break, and then we will consider some of the implications of this GPS paper and where it led to, as well as Yehoshua Bar Hillel's hilarious response to McCarthy. If you read the responses in to the programs with common sense. I don't know. I can't read what Bar Hillel says without imagining like how he's saying it and cracking up. All right, let's take 5 or a few more minutes, and then we will resume. Oh, by the way, this is important. I was mistaken. We in fact do not have class on February 1st, and we do have class on February 8th. In fact, I'll even write that down.
Maybe just a short comment about what I said and how one could think about the questions I posed in a more approachable way. Is maybe to see it as a semantic problem. Just like, okay, how do I understand my own thoughts? Is there some kind of immediate access to it? As the same problem as, okay, when I read a text or when I listen to somebody, and this is conceptualized as some kind of external stimulus, but thoughts are to be had inside the mind, and therefore there is some kind of immediate understanding. But that, okay, what about if I would see my thoughts in the same way as a text that I'm reading, or as something that somebody else says to me? And like, yeah, this is maybe a more approachable.
What do you mean by something somebody says to me?
Yeah, like how we're communicating right now, for example.
But I mean, I don't. Why is this distinct than the first paradigm, a function-based one?
Because wasn't it that that there is,
like, what do you mean by the way we're talking right now? Really, what is how, you know, that could mean many things. What? How are you?
Yes. No, I don't have a determinate conception of that now. The only thing I want to highlight is that we usually make a distinction between, okay, I'm talking to somebody, I'm reading a text. This is okay. I have an outside stimulus, and I can fail to understand these things. I cannot fail to understand my own thoughts. Therefore, understanding my own thoughts isn't even a question that comes up. And if this is the only distinction I want to highlight, and that, okay, when we call into question this distinction, this could maybe and perceive understanding our own thoughts maybe in the same way or in a parallel way about how we understand texts or oral communication and something like that. That how we could approach these very abstract and very skeptical questions which lead you down the rabbit hole with, oh, how do I understand my own thoughts? Just an idea I just had of.
So if we take I mean, this is a curious thought experiment, but I would prompt you to consider, when you're having a perception, the kind that you're describing, and as you said, I don't fail to see my own thoughts, or in the conception of thoughts, I cannot fail to in the act of conceiving, and barring perhaps neurological damage and actual, you know, examples where we could conceive of failure to apperceive, this doesn't mean there's still, I would argue, a kind of negative or positive feedback between the object of thought and cognition. If I'm thinking about a mathematical formula, then I've sort of remodeled this to not just be the conscious flow of processes, but taking an object of thought. And now I can conceive of this in a gradient of complexity, of failure, of success, of partial failure, partial success. Perhaps I understand part of the formula. Perhaps I'm able to do some type of derivation, but not the entirety of this. And I've created essentially a system where there's an observer, right? Whereas in the conscious flow of mentality is sort of like a receipt in the Peircean sense. This is a bit different. This is more so based on, like, you know, informational intake. But I think that, you know, we, especially in reflexive judgments and so on, We take an object of knowledge, and we can do this as a different way to conceive of the matter.
I think you're already coming with a lot of points and a lot of theoretical outside sources. The only thing I wanted to say was what I said, and I don't want to commit to any other presuppositions and theoretical sources outside of that. I mean, we can, but that's not what I want to do here right now.
Well, so but what you're describing is just like the conscious flow of thinking, of mentality. But once you start to reflect on those thoughts, now you are an observer in a system. So now we're back into the same, type of relationship. I'm just arguing that, we can cognize.
But then you could always say, okay, how do I know that what I do is actually reflect and that I'm not still inside the same conscious flow I was all the time? Like, how do I know?
Right. I mean, I would say it's an ontological question. That's a whole different, branch of philosophy.
I think we can continue.
Anyway.
Just a short commentary about how one could approach these questions I just mentioned.
Yes. No. Thank you. I think. I mean. Yes. I think, I think what we see is that there's great debate just on how one even begins taming these questions, and that we may look back and say that there's some things clearly wrong with this symbolic AI paradigm, and yet it gained ground, as I think we saw, because it served as an answer to, I guess, what the theoretical abstractions of the cyberneticians, that while the cyberneticians were proposing a broad model and being very cagey about how it could be applied to humans in particular, by admitting the complexity of that system, it did not have quite the same cash value that, say, even something like solving chess would. That the cyberneticians could not, well, they offered robot turtles, I suppose, but that was sort of as far as it got, and it was, and in a way, I suppose you could say that they were working in a field whose applications were closer to those of economics than to computer science or robotics or artificial intelligence proper, because they weren't out to sort of, while they were aware of this automation, Wiener in particular was serving as much as a critic of it as an advance, as he was as an advancer of it. So at times, any progress at all, even into a dead end, looks better than with no progress at all. So I want to look at some of the implications of this of Simon and Newell's approach and of GPS in particular. And I think people here, as many other people said, there's the sense that something is missing, that this simulation of human thought is a bit of a over aggressive or overly broad claim, but it's precisely because we are working in this hypothetical field of thought, it's harder to say what's gone wrong or what's missing, because a term like common sense is so vague that on the one hand, McCarthy can say this is what common sense is, and it's difficult to say, no, it's definitely, it can't be that. On the other hand, you can easily say, no, that's obviously not what common sense is, and that doesn't get resolved. And what happens is the people who, you know, produce results, I think, get the funding. So what would you know, do people have any comments on the actual comparison, the analysis of the machine trace compared against the human protocol that Simon and Newell do? Because I'm going to speak about that a bit, because a huge amount of the paper is devoted to this. Well, what I would say is that Simon and Newell have eliminated a tremendous amount of context. Symbolic AI, as we know, specializes in very artificially contrived laboratory conditions, but the effect is not necessarily one of artificiality per se, but of massive constraining of possibilities. Simon and Newell aren't necessarily wrong in saying that they see a parallel between the human and the computer, but the reason the parallel exists is not that semantic meaning has been wholly eliminated, but that it has been nearly reduced to nothing. And so correspondingly, the possibilities for different approaches to the problem have been drastically reduced as well. And I want to make an analogy to the present day where we, by comparing the chess program Deep Blue, which is the program that beat Kasparov many years ago, and AlphaZero, which is the contemporary deep learning chess program of today. And Deep Blue does not use deep learning. But both Deep Blue and AlphaZero crush humans. And Deep Blue did it by being sort of very carefully programmed with heuristics, a huge amount of chess knowledge, and human coaching. And in many ways, what Deep Blue did is an extension of the basic approach that Newell and Simon pioneered. And in contrast, AlphaZero accomplished what it did with no human coaching whatsoever. It was given the rules of chess and played 1 billion games and slowly trained its constituent nodes to make better decisions through independent, unsupervised, and mostly opaque means. And maybe what's going on in AlphaZero is something that approximates how humans play chess, and maybe it's even more close than Deep Blue, but we don't know. But at least from our perspective, what AlphaZero does is a different way of learning, even though the symbolic AI people would, I think, maintain that at the heart of it, something similar must be going on. But the problem GPS is considering in the 1961 paper is simple enough that there's really only one way to go about it, which is to consider the possible rules to apply, select one or the other through the application of reasonably specifiable heuristics. So where Simon and Newell make their dodge, in my opinion, is not necessarily in the elimination of context, but in the shrinking of the problem to a point where context couldn't add anything more. And that's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one, and I believe it's what led Simon and Newell to insist that their approach could bear fruit even after symbolic AI was failing to make good on its promises. Keep increasing the processing power, keep increasing the size, keep increasing the logic. The question is, do these logical processes actually scale up in this way, or do some other emergent mechanisms enter the picture, ones which can't be represented as non-emergent local processes? In other words, Simon and Newell having said, yes, there's this emergent logical layer, but that's the final layer. Is that good enough? But it does bear remembering that in spite of the limitations of this approach, the mechanism of formally regimenting such problems and positing logical reasoning processes behind them and trying to get a computer to recreate them was not wholly wrong-headed. In certain contexts, it does work, and it gave rise to what's termed expert systems, where computers could behave semi-intelligently if the domain was sufficiently constrained, where you have, you know, anytime you like go and something asks you like, oh, how are you feeling? You know, what symptoms are you having? And it gives you a list and you check things off, and it sort of concludes from this, you know, oh, this is what you might be sick with. That, you know, that's an expert system sort of thing. And that Bayesianism is also used in these contexts as well, which is why I say that Bayesian degrees of belief are sort of an extension of this, taking the absolute is true false approach and extending it to a continuum of belief. Classic toy expert system is 20 questions. We can say, okay, well, animal, vegetable, or mineral. It's like, okay, well, I've got like something in mind, and you say, okay, is it bigger than a bread box? Yes. Is it alive? No. Is it does it have 4 legs? No. Is it in, you know, can you own it as a pet? Yes. It's a fairly mechanical process. There's a huge amount of context to it, but you could still imagine that if you were to spend enough time, you could imagine nailing down an algorithm to select the right questions and getting, you know, answers and doing a decent job of solving 20 questions and seeming like you're engaging with the world and you know something about the world. Does such a system think? Well, Simon and Newell, I imagine, would say that it does, but if you have the sense that there's at least something missing in this 20 questions approach and training a computer to do a 20 questions approach, then that sentiment is shared by a lot of people. And in this response, and one of the expressions of this happens in 1959 in the responses to, oh, we're talking about machine translation.
Very tangential, I guess, but DeepL sort of relates to this. It's the best one out there. It's certainly better than Google Translates, and the logic is something similar to it.
Yeah, well, I think that was the thing, is, you know, machine translation, the way it was done was absolutely miserable for so many years. And then they made the transition to deep learning approaches, and it got so much better. Certainly better than a lot of people thought it could be. Now, it's still terrible a lot of the time, but it has gotten a lot better. And it's interesting because Yehoshua Bar Hillel was actually one of the pioneering theorists of machine translation before much in the way of machine translation was actually being done. And, you know, translation has certainly been a major philosophical quandary for Quine and Davidson, I guess. Those are the two big people who fought over a great deal. So we get to this rejoinder from the philosopher, linguist, and logician Yehoshua Bar Hillel. And it's interesting, Bar Hillel himself was a student of Carnap's, and actually a much more devoted student than Simon or Newell. Bar Hillel did a lot of work on machine translation, its possibilities and limitations. And he maintained that machine translation could not be exact because the nature of language is simply too variable to allow for very strict categorical representation. And that will cause a problem, obviously, if you try to substitute formal logic symbols for linguistic signifiers. And you see that objection coming through in his response to McCarthy when McCarthy presents his heuristic approach in Programs with Common Sense. And this is on page 12. We should probably open up to this now. Where did it go? 1959, page 12. Here we go. Bar Hillel just like launches right at it. He says, the decisive question how a machine, even assuming that it will have somehow countless millions of facts stored in its memory, will be able to pick out those facts which will serve as premises for its deduction. It's promised to retrieve its in another paper, which is quite right for a half-baked idea. He's saying, in effect, that you can't collapse the levels to treat problem solving as a single layer process. There has to be some other emergent process going on that simplifies the single layer. Otherwise, the problem is intractable. And he continues on page 14.
I'm sorry, David, which article are you referencing?
Oh, programs with common sense.
Okay, thank you.
This is the McCarthy's programs with common sense, where he sort of he basically, what's going on in this paper is McCarthy is taking a heuristic-like approach, an approach similar to Simon's and Newell's, and saying, okay, well, how could we extend this, not solve a problem in formal logic, but how could we solve it to, say, figure out how to go to the airport? And you can see sort of some of the logic steps he lays out on page 7. And if you excuse me for a minute, I'm going to refill this glass of water. Okay, so yeah, so what I'm referring to is on page 12, with 12 and 14, Bar Hillel's objections here. On page 14, he says, I do not think there could possibly exist a program which would, given any problem, divide all facts in the universe into those which are and those which are not relevant for the problem. Developing such a program seems to me by 10 billion orders of magnitude more difficult than, say, the Newell-Simon problem of developing a heuristic for deduction and propositional calculus. This cavalier way of jumping over orders of magnitude only tends to becloud the issue and throw doubt on ways of thinking for which I have a great deal of respect. And fair enough. McCarthy responds, and the crux of McCarthy's response is that these difficulties can be overcome at this level of logical reasoning. McCarthy isn't certain exactly what might be required, but he objects to Bar Hillel, saying that the heuristic approach cannot be refined to be sufficient on its own. So again, the argument is over whether you need another emergent layer. McCarthy says, the rest of Professor Bar Hillel's criticism concern ways in which the model mentioned does not reflect the real world. I have already explained that this was not my intention. He's certainly right that the complexity of the model will have to be increased for it to deal with practical problems. What we disagree on is my contention that the conceptual difficulties arise at the present level of complexity, and that solving them will allow us to increase the complexity of the model easily. In other words, there are problems, yes, and yes, we are treating toy problems right now, but nonetheless, this is it. This is the only game in town, this is how thinking works, and the difficulties are right there before us to be solved. And the closest thing I found to a response from Simon on these issues has been that computers just haven't gotten big enough to do the sort of common sense thinking that people complain symbolic AI can't do. In other words, the problems are not conceptual, but ultimately practical. In 1989, in the Speaking Minds book, he placed a bet on Douglas Lamat's psych project, CYC, which is the project that Drew McDermott criticizes in one of the readings for the AI Winter. The psych project's goal was to build a semantic memory of factual statements about the world in the form of formal logic. The general conclusion is that bet did not pay off. We can still debate, however, exactly how things went wrong. It was not as though the cyberneticians had a track record of practical successes. So it's easy to see how the symbolic AI people thought they were addressing real problems, while the cyberneticians had a grand unified vision of modeling environments, and that vision wasn't yielding much in the way of actual currency, at least not immediately. When symbolic AI could produce a program that played chess, albeit badly, that was still an amazing achievement, and it did shut down some of the objections from Hubert Dreyfus, at least temporarily. So ironically, I think it's once again a case of praxis leading theory, that what could be done with these computers, no matter how limited, still impressed funders, governments, and non-specialists more than cybernetic theory did. The exception, I suppose, being Allende's Chile, and Chile hiring Stafford Beer to create a cybernetic control center for the government. But I would say even that is an odd case of praxis, as Beer was able to popularize cybernetics to a point by yoking it to management theory. And it's in the theory behind symbolic AI that I think you see the shortcuts being taken, particularly with regard to collapsing those levels of abstraction that Carnap refused to collapse. And Simon and McCarthy saying that the difficulties were not a matter of failing to capture any particular abstraction or emergent layer, but the difficulties were merely those of not having yet resolved the conceptual difficulties at this layer of abstraction, the physical symbol system abstraction layer, the only abstraction layer you really need, and perhaps the only abstraction layer that could possibly exist. And that is a truly reductionist move. It's further than Carnap would go. I think it is ultimately the same collapse that Hobbes made centuries earlier, and it's the collapse Leibniz avoided with his postulated distinction between unified godly entities like human minds and disunified aggregates like anything humans might create. And at times, even the symbolic AI people seem to have doubts that this collapse is justified. But remember, they're the ones getting results. They're the only ones getting results, and so they keep pressing forward. And when an alternative paradigm does emerge, as with Frank Rosenblatt's perceptrons, which move centered symbols away from the center of the AI universe, things do get a bit messy. And there's the symbolic AI people, particularly Minsky, go on the attack. So that I think is the position of symbolic AI that I'd like to set out, and I'd like to ask if there's any questions about symbolic AI in this form and time period.
I was kind of wondering about one thing, because we were talking about it very much I keep being confused by the screen, I'm sorry. In cybernetics and information theory. And I mean, it's just kind of like a curiosity of mine, but in what terms, I mean, for example, for the symbolic AI people, as opposed to cyberneticism, did notions of, because they have all these reductive linear assumptions, because they work kind of also, so it's kind of like self-perpetuating in a sense, so they can kind of make machines of glass and metal and make them behave in ways. But did kind of notions about, for example, entropy change, or did it play a different role, or it's just kind of like a curiosity of mine in that regard.
I think in some ways it got factored out, because entropy was, I think you can look again to that Minsky that Minsky quote about overestimating the importance of analog systems and feedback, because where entropy had really had a lot of practical application was in signal processing and the treating of noise in I guess in corruptible and analog communication systems, to basically say, like, well, if we want to ensure that a message gets through, and even though some component, some bits of that message may be lost, corrupted, or whatever, what degree of error correction, what mechanisms of error correction can we use? And to be frank, I don't see that manifesting itself in symbolic AI at all. And that, and I suppose it's an interesting question to say whether the cause of that is practical or theoretical, because again, you have this case where certainly the theory doesn't seem to leave a lot of room for, well, there's one space where it does, but aside from that, but in practical terms, when you're dealing with computers, you know, their faults aren't ones that are entering at the layer of abstraction they want. If there's a bug, you just fix it. You know, they aren't dealing with the computers. The computers they're working with and programming on don't seem to deal with problems that involve information theory and entropy in the way that Shannon had formulated it, and not really seemingly in the extensions that Wiener and Ashby had made to it, and that's what Minsky is saying. Now, the one place where entropy could enter the picture, both for Simon and Newell and I guess for Chomsky even, is in the selection process. Okay, how much information is being considered? Why didn't it? I don't know. Maybe it did. There may be papers out there that I've missed where they talk about this. It may have been a sociological divide in that, you know, this was just seen as something from the field of signal processing, information theory, and cybernetics, and Minsky and McCarthy were charting out something different and didn't want to touch it and didn't see the need for it. It could have been that they thought it was ancillary to their concerns, that they're saying, well, you know, we can certainly use entropic measures to get an idea of the size of the problems to which heuristics have to be applied, but that's, you know, it's an analytical concern. It's not at the heart of the problem, which is figuring out what heuristics to apply in the first place. You know, I think once you get to Bayesianism, there's more of a place for it, and I confess that I don't know to what degree it impacted information theory and Bayes nets and Bayesianism interacted. It doesn't seem to have been a huge one, but there's certainly more room for it.
David, there is one instance. So some research that I do is in drone tracking, and there's you know, an interesting synthesis between some of the stuff we're talking about in regards to symbolic AI and then Bayesian and belief networks, and a reintroduction of the problem of noise. So, you know, machine learning applications vis-a-vis drone tracking, they're able to self-adequate. So they use like tracking images, fusing mobile moving images with hierarchical causal networks, something similar to like Bayesian belief networks.
Right.
Thermal imaging is used to surveil, track, and then predictively construct basic units called quads that form a network sort of capable of like Hebbian learning, where the drone camera patterns environmental data into native modules that are then modeled into inferential sequences. So you take like movement, kinesthetic data, and it's schematized into hierarchical priority, but the drone's eye trains itself to model and project these objects with morphological top-down hierarchies. And this is, you know, quite an active pruning that maps also onto thermal, like heat is the primary differentiation of order out of noise. So that problem of like that cybernetic problem, that informatic adequation problem of Shannon Ashby kind of becomes relevant once more. And it's obviously not just with the drone tracking problem, but this is just one example, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think the question it raises is whether, you know, someone like Simon or Newell would say, well, yes, of course, that's one application, but whether he would consider it as secondary or posterior to heuristics, saying, well, of course, information theory can be applied. It's a useful heuristic at some point. or whether it can take on a pride of place in the way it did in cybernetics.
So you're saying like a hierarchy is important, and still, despite like, yes, it's maybe reintroduced, without the symbolic AI portion, we couldn't even have the tracking business. Like that's super.
Well, that's what they would say.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think that the question is, what is that? If you clearly when you start to build these systems, the engineers start to get desperate and they do whatever it is that will work. So the question is, for people who are more theoretically inclined, when you look at a system that is a bit of a hybrid in this regard, and many systems in this way today are, what do the symbolic AI people say, look, it's all logic. The Bayesians will say, look, it's all Bayes. The machine learning people will say, look, it's all parallelism. And effectively, it's sort of, it's Rashomon sort of. And I mean, Pedro Dominguez in his book, The Master Algorithm, effectively says, look, you are going to merge these approaches together. It's not that one conquers it together, and it's not that the mind relies exclusively on one. However, for political reasons, if nothing else, people will generally tend to say that whatever approach they're pursuing is primary and is the one, and it's the one that rules it. And I think that certainly for symbolic AI that was, cybernetics had a bit more wiggle room because they were so functionalist, so they could always incorporate whatever they want. I think symbolic AI, the fight had to become a bit more fierce because ultimately they had to say that it could that even within the black box there's still some sort of logic going on, and the other representations aren't as important. I mean, it's a difference of degree, not in kind, I suppose. But I think that the symbolists' bet, I think, forced them into a corner more readily. Although that too may have been simply a consequence of the fact that they were making a lot more concrete promises that they didn't make good on. And that brings us to our next subject, which is the Lighthill report. This is the AI winter, and this is the transitional. Oh my God. It is, well, I didn't notice, it just started snowing like crazy. So we're now moving on to the subject of the AI winter, which is what we consider to be the transition between paradigms, sort of the dying of the symbolic AI's dominance and the rise of, well, something else. And one of the inflection points there is this Lighthill report, which is a 1972 report to the UK government and funders from a knighted professor of mathematics at Cambridge, James Lighthill. And this report is frequently credited with killing off symbolic AI funding in the UK and doing a significant amount of damage to it in the US as well. Symbolic AI did lumber on long past this date, but the AI winter is often cited as starting at this date, though some would date it to the 1980s when a good deal of US government funding and corporate investment into symbolic AI dried up in the United States. There had been objections before this in the 60s. We had some lone dissenting voices from Hubert Dreyfus when he was at Rand. But as I said, Dreyfus had somewhat overplayed his hand by claiming that AI would never do even decently well at playing chess. And that at least was proven to be false. And in my opinion, I don't think his use of Heidegger helped his arguments. And from my perspective, they unnecessarily turned a linguistic and conceptual problem to an ontological problem. And because of that, I don't see Dreyfus as advancing on the critique that Bar Hillel had made 10 years earlier. But Writing in 1972, Lightfield doesn't really make a broad philosophical critique, but he starts from the standpoint that AI has simply not delivered what it's promised. Symbolic AI specifically, but AI being symbolic AI at that point. The two are kind of synonymous. And Lighthill considers this failure to be embarrassing and serious. He's conducted a survey of the field and he's not happy with what he sees. And if you look at the list of people he speaks to, it includes John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. And I think we can conclude that Lighthill was not receptive to their arguments. He also spoke to Terry Winograd and Nils Nilsson. And Winograd is unusual in seeming to have made a very good impression on Lighthill, leading Lighthill to praise Winograd's work on computational linguistics with Schudlu. And Jesse, if you have a few minutes, it would be great for you if you could just tell us a bit about Schudlu, specifically from the linguistic perspective, but anything else that you might think might be interesting, and Winograd and Schudlu's place in the AI continuum at that time.
Yeah, sure. I could share my screen just to kind of show I can. Oh, okay. Okay. Can you see my screen? Everyone? Yeah?
Yes.
All right. So this is from a demonstration from Schudlu, which was a program that basically kind of served as a proof of concept for Winograd's PhD. And he did it at the MIT AI lab, and actually Minsky was his supervisor, and he programmed it using Common Lisp, which is based on John McCarthy, basically. So it's kind of interesting. So what it was this kind of, for the time, incredibly stunning interactive program. So you could put in requests to a robot, which is this kind of arm, about a little blocks world that I mentioned last week, which was kind of like typical programs at this time to prove how well these deductive symbolic systems were working. And you could ask Schudlu about the state of this world, the kind of objects that are in it, and you could ask it to actually perform actions there as well. This is what it is right now. Maybe we can, oh yeah, okay. So stack up two pyramids. I can't, which is very entertaining. I really, really love this. It's really good. So you actually see this on a display. So you have to imagine that Winograd or whoever else he's demonstrating this program to is typing this into basically what looks like a fax machine. It's a teletype printer. And it goes into a huge PDP-6 computer, which has a tiny circular display on which you can see this like isometric world, basically. And it's really impressive. I mean, it's one of the works that have been cited a lot around that time. And you can kind of see that it's one of those things where people were genuinely excited and thinking that, oh my God, if we can do this sort of performance, and you kind of see the unbeatable argument almost of this realization of symbolic AI, we can extrapolate to all kinds of problems that we could think of, really. So I've got, okay, yeah, right, that's my screen. 1 second. Okay, oh yeah, so this was the computer that it was on. It's really beautiful. It was, I think it cost in today's money, it cost about $3 million or something like that. This was the input device. Okay, and you can kind of imagine it like this. So you put in your commands here, and then the action goes on here. Okay, so what is interesting in his thesis, he pursues this argument that we've seen with the McCarthy and Hayes paper about what I've kind of been like in my head calling this like integrationist heuristic approach, where you're convinced that, okay, we get to reason when we put together all kinds of functional little automata that relate to each other, and we have a language that describes all of this. So, 1 second, I didn't really prepare this, obviously, but Okay. So we see in the thesis a typical kind of implementation of Lisp where you go through any of these, like every action in the blocks world is defined, but kind of, oh yeah, there's also an emulation online available if you want to check it out. And this is the program that he put together. So at some point, you have everything defined. You have all these relations defined in symbolic Lisp functions. And you can see that it all kind of is managed and everything interrelates. And the idea is then that it gets integrated into interaction. I emailed with Terry Winograd for a bit because I'm doing this as one of my case studies in my PhD. And one interesting thing was, I'm hoping not to violate his privacy here, but I was really intrigued by the demo because there's a couple of instances where, or at least one, which is related to what you said about the entropy of selection, where the robot does things that you wouldn't expect from a very like carefully defined program. For example, at one point it's asked to pick up a pyramid and it just selects one that is actually the furthest away from the arm in this kind of little world. So I think that is kind of interesting. So there would be a pyramid that was much closer, but it doesn't pick that. So how come? It actually goes to the furthest one. But basically, I asked him about how did you demo this and what kind of questions were you asking, or what kind of questions did you receive as asking, or did you receive? And he basically said that when he presented it, that was the conceit. He immediately addressed all the questions that couldn't be answered and just said, no. So we wouldn't need many more heuristics or functional solutions to do this. And in terms of the linguistic thing, to be honest, I'm not much like interested in the linguistics, so I can't really speak to it, to be honest. But what I find really interesting about his definitions on what intelligence is, and I'm not entirely sure where I gathered my quotes on that, but basically it is kind of like, he starts from this notion that, I can stop now, I think. He starts from this notion that we have this, that most of the systems that we're dealing with today are really frustrating because they can't do common sense things. And in a way, throughout his implementation, he's very convinced that, okay, we have to integrate syntax and semantics and basically everything into kind of like this functional connection. And what I think is interesting is that to some extent, he achieves this, but I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. I kind of forgot where I kept the quotes, and that isn't really helpful. So sorry about that. So please maybe say something about that.
Oh yeah. So I mean, I'm glad you showed some of the code because I think you can even see the parallel to to what we saw GPS doing and the general heuristic approach. And indeed, you can even see how a lot of this may have been conditioned by how McCarthy's Lisp allowed people to tackle problems. And you know, certainly, you know, having programmed in Lisp, having programmed a lot, I look at Shridlu and I think, oh boy, that must have taken a lot of time. I can think it's interesting too because I can see, you know, coming in 1970, 71.
He developed it, I think, from 68 to 71, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, coming at around that time, this is going to look incredible to people. People are going to be absolutely stunned, and not just because of the graphics themselves, which are pretty cool, but also I think the natural language mechanism that it would have been, you know, natural language certainly. The problems being solved could certainly have been presented as informal logic problems or in some sort of formal language and like, you know, move block A, you know, move pyramid to space, whatever. But by adding this layer of natural language, it really, I think it performed a version of the imitation, a reverse version. I performed a version of the imitation game by making it seem like it could parse very complex sentences. And at that time, I think there wasn't a lot of question. Well, when we get to Eliza, we'll see about that. But people, there's something about language in particular that if you seem to be responding to language in an intelligent way, even in a very limited context, you do indeed get the impression of there's being some intelligent behavior going on very quickly. And so that's why I think that the natural language aspect of it is very important as well. That Winograd managed to spend a fair amount of time being able to deal with the ambiguities in a very restricted set of English, but in English nonetheless. And I haven't played around with Shridlu personally. I don't know how easy it is to break it by phrasing things in offhand ways. But if you go to Google and you type in questions, you can get it to give you the wrong answer pretty quickly if you phrase things in a strange way. Like,
Do you have a good suggestion for us to do this right now?
Yeah, let me see. If I remember typing in things like for how long has Barack Obama been president, and I got his birthday instead, or things like that. Just phrase things in a peculiar way, who was the last president of the United States? One. Let's see. Yeah, who was the last president of the United States but one? I got Millard Fillmore, who was the 13th president of the United States. So that's not the answer, by the way.
But one is what you said?
Yeah, but one. The last president of the United States.
Did you put this in quotes or did you just Google?
No, but it shouldn't make a difference.
Because I did not get that, but it's interesting because mine may be due
Really?
to my search history and such, since I'm logged into my Gmail. So
I just put the link if you want to try it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, now I see it.
On the other hand, if I type in who was the last president of the United States, I get Donald Trump. Is that the answer, or is it Barack Obama? I don't even know.
Maybe you should ask in a couple of weeks.
First, emperor.
Sorry?
Nothing. Never mind. By the way, one second. I found one quote that I think is interesting because it speaks very much to the symbolic AI, kind of like the mode of proceeding. And one thing that I want to note is that Winograd massively turned around his way of thinking about language, representation, and intelligence, specifically because people like Dreyfus and, from what I've learned today, also McDermott really called out some of the basic assumptions that kind of governed these approaches. Yeah. So he was one of those people that really took part in a kind of more phenomenological turn to computing in like the 80s and 90s, which was really influential in where kind of like the area of HCI where I'm working in at the moment. So I asked him what happened when he was demonstrating, when there were problems or something, and his response was, "I'm sure that while demonstrating, if I didn't stick to a previously checked routine, it ran into bugs or other lapses. Since I was doing it, there weren't problems with inputs of a type it just couldn't handle, since if someone suggested one, I would explain why it wouldn't work without trying it." So I kind of think that's kind of like neatly kind of summarizes some of the edges that that the program kind of knocked against.
Yeah, no, I don't think calling him I don't think it's an exaggeration to call him an apostate. He really did I guess a funny parallel might be Hillary Putnam, who made a similar turnaround in philosophy. And I mean, they must have been in contact, so I wonder about that. I wonder if there was any influence there. But yeah, I mean, so, you know, it works well until it does. They work well until they don't. And then you start debating whether, you know, Simon would say, you know, more heuristics, you know, and other people will say, well, maybe a little more. Oh boy, do we have enough time to get to the Lighthill report? Yeah, I think we can finish it. Okay, so I'll quickly go. You know, so the question is whether is Lighthill's enthusiasm for Schudlu perhaps anomalous with his more general critique? Actually, you know what? I would wonder what Winograd would say if you asked him, like, what do you make of Lighthill's esteem of Schudlu? Do you think that he overestimated it? Can we change the spotlight back to me?
Sure. It wasn't automatic conversation mode.
Oh, that's okay. It was or was not?
It was. That's what it was like, going back and forth. Let me.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to. Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. So so Lighthill divides AI into three fields, which he terms A, B, and C. A he calls automation, which refers to practical domain-specific applications that apply some sort of heuristic or coping behavior rather than, you know, purely deterministic algorithms used on mathematical problems or computational problems. And that harkens back to some of the work that gave rise to cybernetics regarding signal processing, computer perception, and the like. And this is research with obvious applications in specific places, such as the automation of fairly rote tasks performed by humans, by robots, by expert systems, and such. Lighthill says that A has done well, but only under very specific circumstances. And this is on page 6. He says, it is therefore particularly disappointing that the experience of the last 25 years has increasingly forced workers in category A to conclude that advanced automation techniques are successful not when they are developed with a high degree of generality of application, but only when a large quantity of detailed knowledge about the problem domain is utilized in the program design. Category C, which he terms central nervous system research, also harkens back to McCulloch and Pitts rather directly. This is the area of computational neuroscience, studying the extent to which computers can model brain and nervous system activity. He classifies this as basic research with no immediate applications. And he endorses the basic research, but he's singularly down on the practical import of it. This is on page 8, where he says, the 1970s are not the right decade in which to begin researches aimed at applying such techniques to the teaching of any body of knowledge big enough to be of practical interest. But Lighthill saves his most damning analysis for category B, which is the bridge category, which he describes as building robots that do not have immediate applications, but that seek to mimic human thinking and behavior simply for the sake of doing so. And clearly he is talking about, you know, what we have been talking about here, things like GPS. You know, applications and robots that do not mimic the brain, but mimic higher levels of thinking and behavior, working on that level, which Simon Newell postulated it was necessary to work on. And on page 9, he explicitly contradicts them by saying that heuristics are not enough, not even in chess. He says, this evidence and all the rest studied by the present author on AI work within category B during the past 25 years is to some extent encouraging about programs written to perform in highly specialized problem domains when the programming takes very full account of the results of human experience and human intelligence within the relevant domain, but is wholly discouraging about general purpose programs seeking to mimic the problem-solving aspects of human CNS activity over a rather wide field.
So, okay, can I ask for a clarification? You just said something very important, which is part of the GPS paradigm too. Simulating human thought, behavioral paradigms, stimulus and outputs, and Gestalt was a part of this for GPS. But more importantly, you said here, not the thinking of the brain, but higher order processes. And so we have
sorry, not mimicking the workings of the brain.
Yes, not that. Yes,
they are trying to mimic the higher order thinking. but
And
not.
so those higher order processes, which still would go on in the brain, but it wouldn't be the circuitry of like, because I mean, we had like the cybernetic brain metaphor for so long,
Right.
which was abandoned. And maybe now it's become a little bit more popular once again, but for good reason it was abandoned. But there's still, so is it possible, maybe this is like too idiosyncratic to describe what higher order processes were most critical for, you know, particularly Lighthill, but in maybe GPS and Lighthill, or the difference here, like what, I mean, I know this is maybe like asking for terminology related
Well, I
to
think
neuro.
Lighthill, I mean, I guess it's all these vague terms that are being bandied about, like common sense, problem solving, you know, all things that
I want like
Simon,
brain terms, so like neural terms that are not the circuitry, but you know, there's nothing like that. We can't point to any like part of the brain and say these are where the higher order things
well, I think
go.
that's where the I mean, you know, you can say, oh, it's in the cortex of the frontal lobe, but I think that's where the transcendental argument comes in,
Mm-hmm.
that they're saying, you know, it's somewhere in there, you know, somewhere we'll find it, but they don't want to concern themselves with that. They're really sort of saying, like, because we know it's got to be in there, the neuroscientists can spend their time looking for it. But that's, you know, that's why Lighthill is separating out B from C. He's saying that B is sort of saying, well, you know, B pushes that work onto C and says, well, we're just going to explore thought. And for that reason, perhaps Lighthill's critique is primarily practical. He's saying, look, the symbolic people promised X would happen and they didn't deliver it. But implicit in this is the anti-reduction argument against Simon, Newell, and McCarthy's position. Lighthill doesn't come right out and say it, though. He primarily appeals to the combinatorial explosion problem. And when he says that one of the main problems is the failure to recognize the implications of the combinatorial explosion, you can understand why Simon might not actually be convinced by Lighthill. Because while the combinatorial explosion is clearly holding things back, if it is the main problem, then there's still a way out. We have Moore's law. Processing power, processing power is doubling every 12 to 24 months. And so the combinatorial problem specification and solution selection can be handled by the combinatorial explosion of processing power and data storage. So by keeping the debate on the practical level, Lighthill ironically has the effect of making the problem seem more addressable, just not immediately. And so for symbolic AI, you get a bit of a waiting for Godot, in that they say there's nothing wrong with the paradigm. You just need to wait for the technology to catch up and provide the processing power we need. And there's a parallel here to people who believe in the singularity, who say that as soon as computers get powerful enough, the singularity is inevitable. And and since computers are still getting more powerful exponentially, it won't be long now. With the, given the somewhat more modest goal of replicating human thought, the symbolic AI thinkers bank their hopes on technology providing them enough oomph to get them over the practical hump. And that, in fact, did happen. The technology did catch up, just not for symbolic AI. And that's where I'd like to leave off. Yes, Jesse, I'm actually curious what Winograd thinks about what Lighthill said about Shridlu, whether he says, whether he thinks that Lighthill gave him too much of a break.
Well, I might ask him, because I definitely need to contact him again. But when I was speaking to him, it was kind of interesting because I asked him if he had any questions, and he was kind of like, "Well, I'm curious as to what all these questions are for. It was only a lab demo." Kind of. So.
I mean, I suppose, given it now, it makes sense that he would that he would say, look, this is, you know, people made too big of a deal out of it. But, you know, so if we presume that he's looking at it from a technological and philosophical standpoint, that response makes sense. From a historical, sociological, and archaeological perspective, I still think it merits a great degree of importance. But, you know, if it's not what he wants to be remembered for, I very much can sympathize with that. So any final questions? I guess actually I'll logistically speaking, some people had asked, I'd like your papers to be turned in by the final class. If you think you're going to run into any trouble with that, let me know and we can try to work something out. For paper length, I mean, make it as long as it needs to be.
You're going to regret having said this.
What?
You may regret having said this. I have a 50-some page paper that I've been working on. Then it's a lot of these ideas have begun feeding it.
Well, just remember, you know, most things do not need to be as long. Most books don't need to be as long as they are. So that constrains it both ways. Not too short, not too long. You know, the goal is a seminar paper. Certainly, you know, use your best judgment, I guess. If you're really worried about length and size, let me know. But you know.
Are you, so I mean, I don't know if like what everybody else is probably, everybody's working on something a little bit different from their own fields, I assume. For me, there's a paper particularly on like elastic graph bunching, drone tracking, a few other technologies that use the logics of machine learning, and then comparing these logics to like black box approaches versus like those that try to demystify deep learning. There's a lot of like, and this is something I've been working on, it's going to be published in a journal, but there's a lot of like the different segments are like purely theory and philosophy, some of it continental, some of it analytic, and then there's chapters that are more based on like the actual science. And would you be do you have a preference in what you want to read, or would you be more interested in giving feedback to stuff more in the analytic world, more in the science and computation world, or do you enjoy reading all of
I'm flexible. I think what I said to one person was that I would prefer to have a at least some sort of historical or historicist approach that you know, I don't write about Zizek on AI. Take, you know, an actual thing in AI. You can invoke Zizek if you really want to, but don't treat a contemporary, don't put a contemporary thinker at if you want to use contemporary thinkers, use them as tools rather than as foci.
Zizek's not the worst about this, but he's, you know, sometimes he says things that are very wrong when he's talking about quantum computing recently. He's gotten into like it's just everybody's using the quantum mechanics as a metaphor.
Yep, I know, and no one understands it. I mean, it's like people have rushed. I mean, I guess it's the same thing that happened with computers, but now that everybody supposedly understands computers, we need some new field.
It's interesting in that regard, though, because at least the way in which quantum mechanics, I can't even say mechanics, but the way in which it's discussed in reductive terms now, the model is not even new at all. So I wonder if it's the fact that quantum computing has popularized it, but at least like quantum populism or what have you doesn't even necessarily refer to quantum computing. So I do find that to be a kind of curious, because more recent and hairier concepts in quantum, like quantum field theory, et cetera, that that doesn't make the cut in terms of quantum populism. So I wonder precisely how that ended up.
Neither does Everett, like the Everett interpretation even usually. Like they know it very rarely is the innumerable unlimited multiverse bit of it used. It's usually
I think that is part of quantum populism.
I see more so like the Schrodinger's cat bits and the observation effects, but it might be because I'm in like Larwell.
Well, I'm gonna share. So here's a piece that I wrote in which I attempted to create a different, to use quantum physics analogically in a way that people hadn't done it before by using decoherence. I don't know whether I was successful or not, but you might get a kick out of it. And actually it factors into, because, you know, quantum physics is intimately tied to notions of informational entropy. And, you know, that just makes it even worse. So this was my attempt to actually use an entropic formulation of it to muddy things even further. Okay, well, thank you all, and I will see you next week. Remember, no class on February 1st, but class the 2 weeks after. So we've got next week, then a week off, and then 2 more weeks. And as always, email me with any questions. Thank you, and farewell.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.